The Galactic Military Academy on Centauri Prime had always prided itself on producing the finest tactical minds in known space. For the past 8 centuries, its crystalline spires had gleamed against the amber sky, housing cadets from 47 different species who came to learn the sophisticated art of warfare from beings who had, quite literally, written the book on military strategy. Several books, actually, each weighing approximately 14 pounds and requiring at least 6 tentacles to hold properly. The Academy's reputation rested on 3 pillars: academic excellence, physical conditioning, and something the administration liked to call character refinement, which was essentially a polite way of saying they enjoyed watching young beings suffer through increasingly elaborate psychological torture disguised as training exercises. The faculty, composed primarily of species who had never seen actual combat but possessed advanced degrees in theoretical conflict resolution, took particular pleasure in designing challenges that would, in their educated opinion, separate the wheat from the chaff. Which brought them to their current predicament: humanity. The newest members of the Galactic Coalition had arrived 6 months ago with their typically human approach to diplomacy, meaning they had knocked on the front door, introduced themselves with unnecessary volume, and proceeded to ask uncomfortable questions about why certain training protocols seemed designed more for intellectual masturbation than actual military preparedness. The faculty had responded with the kind of dignified silence that only comes from beings who communicate primarily through color-changing skin patterns and consider verbal communication somewhat vulgar. On the human contingent was Cadet Zara Volkov, whose personnel file made for interesting reading if one enjoyed minor heart palpitations. Born on Lunar Colony 7, raised on the asteroid mining station Prometheus, and somehow managing to score in the 99th percentile on every physical assessment, while simultaneously demonstrating what her previous instructors diplomatically termed creative interpretation of established procedures. Instructor Vex Tharlan, a Zephyrian whose species had evolved from what could generously be described as floating jellyfish with opinions, had taken one look at the human's file and declared her the perfect subject for his masterpiece. The Crucible, as he had named it, with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested he had spent considerable time practicing the pronunciation in front of a mirror, represented the culmination of his life's work in military psychology. The chamber itself was a marvel of over-engineering, spanning 3 levels and incorporating environmental hazards that ranged from temperature fluctuations to gravity wells to something called psychic feedback loops that sounded impressive but mostly just gave cadets mild headaches. The maze-like structure had been carefully designed using algorithms that accounted for 47 different species' physical capabilities, psychological profiles, and cultural tendencies toward problem-solving. What it had not accounted for was the human tendency to look at a carefully designed puzzle and ask, "But what if I just break it instead?" The previous record for completing the Crucible belonged to a Centaurian cadet who had managed the course in 27 minutes and 14 seconds, emerging with what the medical staff had classified as moderate psychological trauma and a nervous tic that caused him to salute doorways. Most cadets required the full 30-minute time limit, and approximately 15% never made it out at all, requiring emergency extraction and several weeks of therapy. Vex Tharlan had spent months preparing for this moment, studying human psychology through what he considered authoritative sources, primarily adventure films from Earth's entertainment industry, and a philosophical treatise titled Why Humans Do Things, a xenobiological analysis of Deathworld psychology, written by someone who had clearly never met an actual human. The observation deck overlooked the Crucible like a theater box, complete with refreshment stations serving what passed for snacks among species that photosynthesized their nutrition. Faculty members and select cadets had gathered to witness what Vex Tharlan assured them would be a fascinating study in human limitation when confronted with superior strategic design. Admiral Kethmore, the Academy's commandant and a Centaurian whose career had been built on never having to make difficult decisions, watched the proceedings with the kind of detached interest that came from knowing that whatever happened, it would ultimately be someone else's problem. His species had perfected the art of bureaucratic survival through the simple expedient of making every statement technically correct while being functionally useless. The human cadet entered the chamber with the kind of casual stride that suggested she was heading to the commissary rather than confronting what the Academy's promotional materials described as the ultimate test of military readiness. She wore standard training gear that had been modified to accommodate human physiology, meaning it actually fit properly instead of being designed for beings with 6 limbs and exoskeletons. Vexthalan activated the observation screen with a flourish that caused his translucent form to shimmer with what his species considered dignified excitement. Observe, colleagues, as we witness the systematic deconstruction of human confidence when confronted with true intellectual complexity. The timer began its countdown from 30 minutes. For the first 30 seconds, Zara simply stood at the entrance, head tilted slightly as she examined the corridor ahead. The maze stretched before her, its walls gleaming with the kind of metallic finish that suggested both advanced technology and someone's desperate need to make everything look more impressive than it actually was. Environmental sensors detected her presence and began their carefully orchestrated sequence of psychological pressure tactics. The temperature dropped 5 degrees. Subtle audio frequencies designed to induce anxiety began playing. The lighting shifted to the red end of the spectrum, because nothing said challenging military exercise like making everything look like the inside of a particularly aggressive mood ring. Zara's response to this carefully crafted assault on her psyche was to reach out and knock on the wall with her knuckles, the way someone might test the ripeness of a fruit. The sound echoed through the chamber with a hollow quality that suggested the walls, despite their impressive appearance, were not exactly built to military-grade specifications, a fact that became immediately relevant when Zara stepped back, sized up the wall like a construction worker evaluating a demolition project, and drove her shoulder into it with the kind of force that suggested she had experience removing obstacles that didn't want to be removed. The wall, which had been designed to contain cadets for the next 8 centuries, folded like origami in a hurricane. On the observation deck, Instructor Vexthalan made a sound that his species produced when experiencing what humans would recognize as the early stages of a nervous breakdown. It was somewhere between a whistling tea kettle and a cat being stepped on, with harmonic overtones that suggested impending existential crisis. That's not how the exercise works," he whispered, his form flickering between transparency levels in a way that indicated severe emotional distress. Admiral Kethmore leaned forward with the expression of someone watching a natural disaster from a safe distance. "Perhaps she's attempting to establish an alternative route through the maze?" "There is no alternative route. The maze is the route. The maze is the entire point of the exercise." Zara, meanwhile, had moved to the next wall and was examining it with the kind of professional interest that might be displayed by someone whose job involved removing things that were inconveniently placed. She tried the knuckle test again, nodded to herself with apparent satisfaction, and proceeded to kick a hole clean through what the engineering department had assured everyone was reinforced polytanium composite with integrated structural harmonics. The hole was roughly human-sized and had jagged edges that suggested the wall had not been designed with this particular application in mind. "She's not solving the maze," observed Cadet Thexki, a Rigelian whose species communicated primarily through changes in skin color and was currently displaying patterns that roughly translated to confused mathematical equation. "She's destroying it instead." This observation proved to be remarkably prescient, as Zara had apparently decided that walls were more of a suggestion than an actual barrier. The next 5 minutes consisted of what could generously be described as aggressive architecture modification, as she carved a straight line through obstacles that had taken Vexthalan 3 years to design and the engineering corps 6 months to construct. Each impact sent vibrations through the observation deck that caused refreshment glasses to rattle and several faculty members to make the kind of noises their species produced when witnessing something that challenged their fundamental understanding of how the universe was supposed to work. "Perhaps we should stop the exercise," suggested Professor Yithmara, whose species had evolved from creatures that lived in caves and had developed an instinctive fear of loud noises and structural instability. "We can't stop the exercise." Vexthalan's form was now flickering so rapidly that he resembled a malfunctioning hologram. 847 years of academy tradition, decades of psychological research, the integrity of our entire pedagogical framework. The integrity of their pedagogical framework was currently being re-evaluated by someone who had apparently decided that the most efficient route between 2 points was a straight line, regardless of what might be occupying the space in between. Zara had acquired what appeared to be a piece of debris from her earlier demolition work and was using it as an improvised battering ram, with the kind of systematic efficiency that suggested this was not her first experience with obstacle removal. The environmental hazards that had been carefully calibrated to challenge cadets were proving somewhat less effective against someone who treated them as minor inconveniences. The temperature fluctuations were handled by the simple expedient of ignoring them. The gravity wells were bypassed by the straightforward approach of not going where they were. The psychic feedback loops were apparently ineffective against someone whose psychological profile could be summarized as stubborn beyond all reasonable bounds. "How is she doing that?" whispered Cadet Zorkan, a draconian whose species prided itself on physical strength and was currently watching a being half his size systematically dismantle structures that he couldn't have dented with his best effort. "Deathworld physiology," Admiral Kethmore replied, with the kind of clinical detachment that came from having read the briefing materials. "Their home planet apparently features weather that tries to kill them, predators that consider them prey, and natural disasters that occur with the regularity of seasonal festivals. The theory is that this produces beings with certain enhanced capabilities." The theory was proving remarkably accurate, as Zara worked her way through what had been level 2 of the maze, leaving behind a trail of architectural debris that looked like the aftermath of a small explosion. She had developed a rhythm to her destruction that suggested she was actually enjoying herself, humming what sounded like a working song as she systematically reduced Vexthalen's masterpiece to its component materials. The timer showed 12 minutes remaining. "At this rate," observed Thexki, whose skin patterns had shifted to what roughly translated as mathematical impossibility detected, "she'll complete the course in less than 5 minutes. "That's impossible," Vexelium protested, though his voice had taken on the kind of hollow quality that suggested he was beginning to suspect that his understanding of possibility might require some revision. "The course is designed to take 30 minutes. The psychological pressure curves alone require at least 25 minutes to achieve optimal effectiveness." The psychological pressure curves were currently being ignored by someone who had apparently never read the manual explaining how they were supposed to work. Zara had reached what had been the central chamber of the maze, a space designed to present cadets with a complex decision tree involving multiple pathways, each with their own risks and rewards. Her solution to this carefully crafted intellectual challenge was to look around the chamber for approximately 10 seconds, select the wall that appeared to be most directly between her current position and the exit, and proceed to create a new doorway using the same technique that had proved so effective throughout her journey. The sound of this latest demolition project echoed through the observation deck like a death knell for 8 centuries of military tradition. "She's going to complete the entire course," Admiral Kethmore observed with the kind of calm that suggested he had already begun mentally composing the incident report. "In under 10 minutes. "This is unprecedented," Professor Yithmora whispered, her voice carrying the tone of someone witnessing the heat death of the universe. "The implications for our entire assessment methodology." "Forget the methodology." Vexthalen's form was now barely visible, flickering between states of matter like a creature caught between dimensions. "What about my maze? Do you have any idea how long it took to calculate the optimal wall placement, the psychological impact studies, the environmental hazard integration protocols?" The environmental hazard integration protocols were currently being reduced to academic curiosity by someone who had apparently decided that the fastest way through any hazard was to eliminate it entirely. Zara had acquired a second piece of debris and was now operating what could generously be described as a dual-wielding demolition system, taking down walls with the kind of systematic efficiency that suggested she had given serious thought to the most effective techniques for structural modification. The timer showed 8 minutes remaining. She was now in what had been the final section of the maze, a space designed to test cadets' ability to navigate complex three-dimensional puzzles while under extreme time pressure. The section featured rotating platforms, moving walls, and what Vexthalan had proudly described as dynamic obstacle integration, meaning things moved around in ways that were supposed to be confusing. Zara's approach to dynamic obstacle integration was refreshingly straightforward. If it moved, she broke it. If it was in her way, she went through it. If it was designed to confuse her, she ignored it completely and focused on the general direction of the exit. The rotating platforms stopped rotating after she introduced them to her improvised demolition tools. The moving walls stopped moving after she demonstrated that their movement was dependent on structural integrity they no longer possessed. The dynamic obstacle integration became significantly less dynamic when most of the obstacles ceased to exist. 2 minutes, Thexky announced, his skin patterns now displaying what roughly translated as reality malfunction in progress. 2 minutes and she's destroyed the entire course, Admiral Kethmore added helpfully. Because sometimes stating the obvious was the only way to process events that exceeded one's capacity for strategic thinking. Vexthalan had stopped flickering and was now maintaining a steady state of what appeared to be traumatic shock. His life's work, 8 centuries of military tradition and the fundamental principles of tactical assessment were currently being converted into a pile of expensive debris by someone who had approached the entire exercise with the kind of practical problem-solving that suggested she had never been properly educated about the theoretical impossibility of what she was doing. The final wall between Zara and the exit was the thickest, most reinforced barrier in the entire complex. It had been designed to withstand siege weapons, natural disasters, and the kind of desperate fury that came from cadets who had spent 29 minutes navigating an increasingly hostile environment, only to discover that the exit was protected by what amounted to a bank vault door. Zara looked at this ultimate barrier, tested it with her knuckles in the way that had become her signature move, and then stepped back to consider her options. For a moment, the observation deck held its collective breath, wondering if she had finally encountered an obstacle that would require her to engage with the exercise as it had been designed. She picked up a piece of debris from one of the earlier walls, hefted it experimentally, and then began using it as a sledgehammer with the kind of methodical persistence that suggested she was prepared to continue this approach until either the wall or the heat death of the universe gave way first. The wall gave way first. The timer showed 28 minutes and 17 seconds remaining when Zara stepped through her final improvised doorway and into the exit chamber, where she was greeted by automated systems that had been programmed to congratulate successful cadets on their demonstration of tactical excellence and strategic thinking. "Congratulations, cadet," the system announced in the kind of synthesized voice that suggested someone had spent considerable time programming appropriate emotional inflection. "You have successfully completed the Crucible, demonstrating the kind of tactical excellence that represents the finest traditions of the Galactic Military Academy." Zara looked around the exit chamber, brushed some dust off her uniform, and responded with the kind of casual indifference that suggested she had just completed a routine training exercise, rather than systematically demolishing what had been considered the ultimate test of military readiness. "Thanks," she said, apparently unaware that she had just invalidated 8 centuries of military theory in under 2 minutes. "That was fun. What's next?" On the observation deck, silence reigned with the kind of absolute authority that typically followed natural disasters or the collapse of major philosophical systems. Faculty members stared at the monitor screens showing the devastation that had once been the Crucible, their expressions suggesting they were witnessing something that challenged their fundamental understanding of how the universe was supposed to work. Admiral Kethmore was the first to speak, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just watched the laws of physics submit their resignation. "I believe we may need to revise our assessment protocols." Professor Ythmora made a sound that her species produced when experiencing cognitive dissonance on a scale that required new vocabulary. "Revise our protocols? We need to revise our understanding of what constitutes a military exercise." Vexthalan, meanwhile, had achieved a state of philosophical paralysis that suggested he was reconsidering not only his career in military education, but also his fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. His form had stabilized into what appeared to be permanent transparency, as if the shock had caused him to partially phase out of existence. "My maze," he whispered, his voice carrying the kind of hollow quality that accompanied the death of dreams. 847 years of tradition, decades of research, the finest example of tactical assessment ever devised. "It was a very nice maze," Admiral Kethmore offered diplomatically, though his tone suggested he was already mentally preparing for the kind of administrative meetings that followed unprecedented events. "I'm sure the historical archives will preserve its memory appropriately." The historical archives would indeed preserve the memory of the Crucible, though not in the way Vexalian had originally envisioned. Rather than being remembered as the ultimate test of military readiness, it would be recorded as the day the Galactic Military Academy learned that their sophisticated understanding of tactical assessment had been missing a rather important variable: the possibility that someone might look at a carefully designed challenge and decide that the most efficient solution was to break it. The engineering report, filed 3 days later, made for fascinating reading if one enjoyed technical documentation that bordered on existential crisis. The damage assessment ran to 47 pages and included phrases like "structural integrity compromised beyond theoretical possibility" and "metallurgical analysis suggests forces exceeding design parameters by orders of magnitude." The final page contained a single recommendation written in what appeared to be increasingly desperate handwriting: "Suggest immediate revision of all training protocols to account for Deathworld psychological profiles." The psychological evaluation of Cadet Zara Volkov proved equally illuminating, though for entirely different reasons. When asked about her approach to the exercise, she had responded with the kind of straightforward logic that suggested she had never considered any alternative. The goal was to get out of the maze as quickly as possible. Going through walls was faster than going around them. When pressed for details about her tactical reasoning, she had shrugged in the way that indicated she considered the question somewhat unnecessary. "Walls are just materials arranged in inconvenient configurations. If you need to go somewhere and there's a wall in the way, you move the wall. It's not complicated." The Academy's finest experts in military psychology had spent weeks analyzing this statement, searching for hidden depths of strategic thinking that might explain how she had managed to deconstruct their most sophisticated assessment tool with what appeared to be the intellectual equivalent of a sledgehammer. Their final report concluded that either human psychological profiles represented a completely unprecedented form of tactical cognition, or that their understanding of tactical cognition required fundamental revision. The truth, as is often the case, was considerably simpler than the experts were prepared to acknowledge. The Galactic Military Academy had spent 8 centuries developing increasingly sophisticated solutions to military problems, refining their approaches until they represented the pinnacle of theoretical excellence. What they had failed to consider was the possibility that someone might encounter their theoretical excellence and respond with the kind of practical simplicity that didn't recognize the difference between sophisticated and unnecessarily complicated. 6 months later, the Crucible was reopened as a training facility, though with some significant modifications. The new version featured walls constructed from materials that could, according to the engineering specifications, withstand direct impact from projectiles up to and including small asteroids. The environmental hazards had been recalibrated to account for beings whose homeworld had apparently prepared them for conditions that exceeded the previous understanding of survivable. Most significantly, the exercise now included what the administration diplomatically termed alternative completion methodologies, meaning that cadets were no longer required to navigate the maze according to its original design parameters. A new assessment category had been created for what military theorists were calling direct action problem solving, though the faculty still seemed somewhat uncomfortable with awarding high marks for what amounted to controlled demolition. The revised scoring system attempted to balance traditional tactical assessment with what Admiral Kethmore had described in his official report as innovative approaches to obstacle neutralization. In practice, This meant that cadets could now receive full marks for either completing the maze as originally designed or for finding ways to make the maze irrelevant to their objectives. Surprisingly, most cadets continued to attempt the traditional approach, suggesting that 8 centuries of military education had been more effective than anyone had realized at teaching beings to think within established parameters. The few who attempted what became known as the Volkov method generally lacked either the physical capability or the psychological inclination to systematically dismantle their environment in pursuit of their objectives. Zara herself had moved on to advanced tactical courses, where she continued to demonstrate the kind of creative problem-solving that made her instructors simultaneously proud and nervous. Her personnel file now included a special notation that roughly translated as "recommend creative assignment parameters," and was used by administrative staff who had learned that traditional approaches to military education might not apply to beings whose definition of tactical flexibility included architectural modification. The story of the Crucible eventually spread throughout the Academy, becoming the kind of legend that cadets shared during late-night discussions about the nature of military excellence. Different species told different versions, but they all included the same basic elements: a human cadet, a maze designed by the finest military minds in the galaxy, and 2 minutes of destruction that had redefined everyone's understanding of what constituted tactical thinking. Instructor Vex Tullen eventually recovered from his philosophical crisis, though he never again designed training exercises that assumed cadets would approach problems according to established theoretical frameworks. His new specialty became what he called adaptive response protocols, meaning exercises designed to remain functional regardless of how cadets chose to interpret their objectives. In his private moments, he sometimes wondered if the galaxy's approach to military education had been missing something important for the past 8 centuries: the possibility that sophisticated solutions might not always be superior to simple ones. The idea that sometimes the most elegant approach to a complex problem was to make it less complex. He never shared these thoughts publicly, because admitting that a human cadet had taught him something fundamental about military strategy would have required acknowledging that 8 centuries of Galactic Military Academy tradition might have been unnecessarily complicated. Instead, he focused on developing new training protocols that could accommodate beings who looked at carefully designed challenges and asked uncomfortable questions about whether they needed to be quite so challenging. The Academy's reputation survived the incident, though it now included a footnote that hadn't existed before: the understanding that military excellence could take forms that exceeded the boundaries of traditional tactical theory. Recruitment materials began including subtle references to diverse problem-solving approaches and adaptive strategic methodologies, which was the diplomatic way of acknowledging that sometimes the best solution to a sophisticated problem was to make it someone else's problem entirely. And in the end, perhaps that was the most valuable lesson of all: that true tactical excellence might have less to do with sophisticated theoretical frameworks and more to do with the practical ability to achieve objectives regardless of what obstacles had been placed in the way, even if achieving those objectives required converting those obstacles into construction debris in under 2 minutes. The galaxy, it seemed, still had a few things to learn about warfare from the newcomers, who treated walls as suggestions and sophisticated tactical challenges as opportunities for creative demolition. Whether this represented an evolution in military thinking, or simply the inevitable result of recruiting beings from a planet that had spent millions of years trying to kill them, remained a subject of ongoing academic debate. But somewhere in the Academy's archives, preserved for future generations of military theorists, sat a 2-minute recording of a human cadet systematically dismantling 8 centuries of tactical tradition, with nothing more than determination, improvised tools, and the kind of practical problem-solving that came from a species that had learned to thrive on a world where everything was trying to kill them. It was, the archivists noted, a remarkably educational document,